Welcome back, everyone. We are back for another episode of the Agile Mentors Podcast. I'm here with you, almost as always, Brian Milner. And today I have the one and only Mike Cohn back with us. Welcome in, Mike.
Brian, it's good to see you. I think you are here always, aren't you? Have you ever called in sick for an episode?
Well, pretty much. We did have the one little segment of time here that we kind of had the takeover.
Yeah, Scott took over.
Yeah, so that's the only gap. Otherwise, it's been me along for this journey. We wanted to have Mike on because Mike's been working on some stuff recently that we both have been kind of doing some work with individual clients and talking about helping people make the leaps, the transitions that need to happen. And Mike's kind of developed a framework around this, really based on a lot of the writing that you did back in your book, right?
Yeah, a lot of this goes back to leading transitions since about 2008, significant size transitions.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's the thing that people I think often don't understand is that these kind of things, when organizations come and meet with you, they often think we must be really unique and have something that no one else has ever had before. But then at the end of the day, it turns out they're all pretty similar. They all pretty much have the same kind of things that they're struggling with. And so there are patterns that you can put in place to help do this in a successful way. And Mike has this pattern that he has put together. And one of the things that I believe in really strongly, I learned this from Mike and others as well, is that when you are trying to guide any kind of change effort like this, especially if it's an agile change effort, that it's really useful to try to use these agile practices in becoming more agile. And one of those is a transformation backlog. So for the people who aren't really familiar with that term, Mike, or what that means or what it would look like or why it's better than another way of doing this kind of thing, what's important or special about a transformation backlog?
Yeah, good question. I want to comment on the uniqueness thing because you made me think about that a little bit differently the way you described that. I think we both agree. I mean, every client is unique, right? But I think what makes a good consultant or even a good coach is discovering patterns and looking for the patterns that apply. And so, we rarely see exactly the same situation twice with two different companies or even two different teams. It's not exactly the same. But you can draw on that experience. You go, I've seen this behavior over here. Here's what kind of worked. Let me try something similar here. And so it's noticing those patterns. And I think that is what led to kind of the way I think about Agile initiatives, right? And how we get better. And you're right. A big part of that is using Agile to get Agile, right? We don't want to, you don't want to have a Gantt chart of how to get Agile, right? That would just be a complete impedance mismatch. So a big part of that for me is the backlog, right? I mean, backlogs to me are, I wouldn't say they're like the most important thing about Agile, but they're kind of the most in your face thing about Agile, right? I mean, what are we going to do, right? You got to have at least a little list of what you're going to do. And so backlogs are a pretty prevalent thing. And so I like working with organizations and creating what we refer to as an improvement backlog or transformation backlog. But it's a list of the things that you want to get better at. And you load that up. At the start, you can think of things that just kind of naturally are going to be there. Like, how do we train our coaches? How do we identify who are good Scrum Masters? Those are going to be, part of the pattern that pretty much every organization is going to have. But then you look for specific things within a team or a company, and you come up with specific improvement ideas to go on that backlog.
Yeah, I agree. It's always been something I've tried to do as well. And I think it's, one of the things I love about it is that it's mirroring what you expect to see from them. And I think it gives them that ability to have that transparency into what's going on. It's not a black hole, right? And they know where things can go when they have something that they feel like needs focus. So for all those reasons and a lot of others, I agree that I think it's the right approach to take. I know that in trying to come up with things and identify areas to work on, you've kind of come up with this approach of 5 pillars, and I love them. I think they're great. I think they really kind of highlight the different areas that things can pop up in. Wonder if you might just talk us through one of those pillars and tell us what the concept is behind it.
Yeah, I think it fits into that whole idea of seeking patterns, right? And, you might have 100 things on your improvement backlog, but who wants to read a list of 100 things? So you naturally kind of want to group them. And so, for example, this grouping of things might be part of what we refer to as the mindset pillar. And, you really, I don't think you can be agile unless you have cultivate an agile mindset. And you have to think in an agile manner so that you're approaching a team does have to think in an agile manner so that they're approaching problems and situations and going at it with an idea of inspect and adapt and small increments and thinking about it that way. And if we're not thinking in an agile manner, you're going to have a really hard time of getting agile later.
Yeah, I agree. Would you think of mindset as sort of being the first in the list, the top of the list, or do you see these as kind of all equal?
That's interesting. I guess they're probably all equal in that if we fall short with any one of the five pillars, I assume we'll talk about all five of them. If we fall short in any one, we're going to have problems, right? And I do always think of mindset as the foremost among them. Don't know if it's the most important, but it's often the hardest to create inside of an organization. Just to kind of mention the second pillar, and we can talk about it more later, but just to mention it kind of in contrast is practices, right? And, we can have a team that goes through the practices of Agile and they do a daily meeting and they have a backlog and they do a review and they plan and they retrospect and, they do all those things. But if they haven't really internalized it, right? I mean, from the outside, they look Agile, but at the first sign of trouble, do they stick with Agile, right? If they haven't really cultivated that mindset. And so I think practices is an important pillar. It's the second one that I always list, but it is a little bit subordinate to mindset. You have to have that Agile mindset, or I think when times get tough, the practices don't stick.
Yeah.
You'll remember the capability maturity model, the CMMs. A lot of questionable stuff in there. But one of the things I absolutely loved this about CMM is they had level 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and level 2 is where you defined your process, right? You had it written down, you knew what your process was. And level 1 was just kind of chaos. You just really just kind of ad hoc development. And what I loved is they said, you're truly at level 2 when a crisis hits and you stick with it, right?
Mm,
And, I think about that with Agile and like, if you believe in daily meetings, just as an example, when a crisis hits, you don't go, oh crap, we're too busy to do those daily meetings. Let's skip that junk, right?
yeah.
No, those daily meetings, those daily synchronization points, whether they're a meeting or Slack check-ins these days, but having that synchronization point every day is valuable. And if you truly believe that, you don't give it up when a crisis hits. You may say, let's do it at 2 o'clock because my head's in this thing right now, but you don't skip it. And I kind of learned that from the CMM, that was an important thing, that you've really arrived at a defined process when you don't give up your process in a crisis.
Yeah. No, that's a great point. And I like how you frame that with mindset and practices. I agree. It seems like sometimes people start with the practices and feel like that's the entirety of it, is just let's get people trained on, we have this meeting and then we have this meeting, and then people show up for it and think, well, why are we here? They know what they're supposed to do but not why, and that kind of speaks to that mindset pillar that you addressed there. So that's great.
Well, I know you're a movie fan, and this is an interesting debate that's lingered in Agile literally since the beginning. I remember these debates back in 2003 at conferences, and it was the Karate Kid debate, right? Think about the Karate Kid. He's just waxing the car all day. He's just doing the practices, right? And all of a sudden, he can magically fight, if I remember the movie correctly, right? Don't know that it really works out that way, but if you have a team that's just waxing on all day, they're doing all the practices. They never have any idea why they're doing those. Well, Mr. Miyagi said to, right? Agile coach Miyagi told me to do this. Are they truly agile, right? And that's been a debate about agility since the beginning, right? If they're doing all the practices, can't say they're not agile, right?
Yeah.
But to me, they won't stay agile when a crisis hits.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a great point. Well, let's keep building because we talked about mindset and practices, and I know there's 5 of these. What would be the next thing to build on apart from mindset and practices?
The next one for me is roles, right? Roles. And there's really kind of two categories there. There's the new roles that Agile introduces, where we'll often have a product owner. We might have a Scrum Master or Agile coach. But then we also change roles, right? Developers, and I use developers to mean anybody on the development side of the problem, right? So programmer, tester, analyst, database person, designer. The developers' roles change, right? They have to become more holistic. They're never going to say that's not my job, right? They're going to do whatever they can to help out. And so when we introduce Agile, we have to clarify the new roles and we have to be clear about the changes to existing roles, right? What changes? Maybe we don't have a product owner, but the product manager now has to be more involved day to day with the team, if that's how we go. And so there's that change roles and the new roles that we have to introduce.
Yeah, because everybody wants to know who's responsible for that, right? I mean, and so you can get into these kind of back and forths on, do we need a RACI chart? Do we need all these other things? What's your opinion when people kind of bring that topic up?
So many people in Agile are opposed to RACI charts, and it's like, I get the point. I can see the value to doing that as long as you don't take it too seriously. Like, I want to go through the exercise of creating it, but then I kind of want to throw it away and I don't want to look at it anymore, right?
Yeah.
But the discussion, the argument about who does this, that type of thing can be useful. The example I used to love sharing in classes was I'd always get in teaching a class, somebody say, who's responsible for the product backlog, right? And I always used to like to counter that with an example of, I have 2 daughters and they were much younger when I was first teaching. And I would say, well, who's responsible for my daughters becoming a productive member of society, right? And, is it my daughter herself? Is it my wife, their mother? Is it me? Who is it? And, people would get the concept, say, well, it's all of you, right?
Right.
And I would joke and say, no way, it's my wife because I'm out here traveling to teach a Scrum class. But, it's clear, right? It's everybody's responsibility. It's the kids, it's the parents' responsibility that the kid grow up to be a productive member of society. And, who's responsible for the product backlog? Well, everybody is, right? I mean, if the team members look at it and go, man, product owner's been too busy to refine these backlog items, I'll do it, right? Everybody should help out, but primarily who's responsible? Sure. Let's say the product owner. So I'm not opposed to RACI charts. I just don't want to take them too literally. And I don't want to have the language lawyers pointing to it and go, it says you're supposed to do this, right? And you haven't.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. I think there's something that comes up in classes sometimes where, we'll be talking about who's responsible for one thing or who's responsible for another. The students will throw out, well, but couldn't anyone do that? Like, let's take writing user stories, right? Couldn't anyone write a story and have it go in the backlog? Well, yeah, they can, right? Anybody can add things to the backlog. So I often think about it like with the word ultimately. Who's ultimately responsible for it? If it doesn't happen, who is the person that should have stepped up and made sure that it happens?
Yep. But then we get into I do think of myself somewhat as a writer, even though I, don't write that as much anymore, but I, think of myself as a writer. And so I should care a whole lot about words, but then we get into like, well, this person's responsible and this one's accountable. And I was like, oh, my head's spinning.
Right. Exactly.
Who does the thing, right? And I think about my old boss way back early in my career who always referred to the one throat to choke, right?
Yeah.
Who do I get to go yell at if something goes wrong, right? And it's like, okay, I guess that's the accountable person. But I don't know. I mean, there are differences between accountable and responsible, but I always have to stop and think about, okay, which means this, which means that. And
right.
If you got to stop and think about it, it's too hard.
Yeah, I agree. All right, so we got mindset, practices, roles. What do we build after? Where do we go from there?
Yeah, there's 2 more. The next one I'd say would be teamwork. And, we're touching on that a little bit with the roles. Team members are going to interact with each other differently. And that's one of the pillars of a successful Agile initiative is improving teamwork. We're going to be interacting more closely with one another. We're going to be interacting more frequently. We're going to be sharing responsibility, what we're just talking about. And all of those are changes for team members. We're not going to be necessarily supportive on an agile team of the person that says, give me 2 months, I'll go away and I'll build this thing and I'll come back and give it to you perfectly. And I've seen that work, but not really on an agile team. And so we changed teamwork. That'd be the fourth pillar.
Okay. So teamwork. So mindset, practices, roles, teamwork. And then what's the final one?
The last one is outside the team, right? And so, I didn't want to really kind of call it culture because that's a little too big and too fancy, but it's everything outside the team, right? It's going to be hard to have a successful agile initiative if those outside the team are impacting the team in certain ways, right? If you've got a sales group out there making promises about dates and commitments, it's hard for the team. If you have any sort of leader interrupting the team constantly and not understanding the impact of that, totally fine to interrupt the team, but you better understand the impact, right?
Yeah.
And then choose to take that impact. So if you have these outsiders behaving in non-agile ways, it's going to impact an agile initiative. And that's really what these pillars are about. They're about the 5 things that we need in order to have successful agile initiatives.
Yeah. I love them because they're systematic. It reminds me of sort of the old Ishikara fishbone diagram, root cause analysis of how you kind of think systematically through different ways of what might be the root cause of the problem.
Yep, absolutely.
Now, you talk about using these as a way to connecting back to what we talked about earlier, the improvement backlog, and ways that we can sort of start to use these to generate those items that might go into our improvement backlog. I'm wondering if do you have a practical example of that, or can you demonstrate for us how that would actually work?
Sure, they're really thinking tools, right? So if you notice a problem with a team, it's useful to ask yourself, are we seeing a problem with mindset? Nope, that's okay. Are we seeing a problem with practices? No, team's doing okay there. Is it a problem with role clarity, right? Is it a problem with teamwork, or is it a problem with outside influence? And so think about the 5 pillars, and that will often help you identify a way to fix the problem, right? And then the way to fix that problem, that goes on your improvement backlog. And so as an example in this, I'm thinking of a very specific company I worked with, but you and I've both experienced this countless times, would be a team that is struggling with kind of what is agile, right? And they're not using it the same way, inconsistent use of terminology. And, one team might think 2-month sprints are okay. Another team is doing 1-week sprints. The team I'm thinking about actually had a difference. They were using the term sprint and iteration. And I've already mentioned that, despite being a writer, I'm not that big of a word purist. And so the first day or two that I'm with this company and they're using sprint and iteration both, doesn't bother me. It's just some people have different preferences for words. No big deal. But then we're in a meeting and somebody said, well, that's what we do during an iteration. It's totally different during a sprint. Like, huh? Aren't they the same thing? I thought you guys reasoned them the same way. And this, oh, no. An iteration is when we're working at a sustainable pace. A sprint is when we have to work overtime, right? It's like, that's a pretty good distinction, right?
Yeah, right.
I kind of like that, right? I'm running at a sustainable pace for the first 26 miles of a marathon, and I'm sprinting for the last 0.2 to beat the guy next to me that I've been running next to for 5 miles, right? And so, okay, sprint made sense. And so what we decided there is that we needed to put an item or two on the backlog, and these being kind of in the mindset category of improving kind of our definition of what is agile. Right. And so do a little bit of kind of fundamental training, just some vocabulary, things like that. Hey, when we use these words, they mean this. And, here's some guidelines. Let's not use 2-month sprints. And so we had to get a little bit more in the mindset of what is agility.
I kind of want to throw a curveball here a little bit at you, because I know you talk about this as being the backlog, and a backlog has a team. Right, a backlog has someone who's doing it. So I wonder if that's a question in listeners' minds here. Well, who's actually doing this? Who's actually carrying this out? If you need to clarify, the difference between a sprint and an iteration, who's the person who's doing that, or who's the team that's doing that? So whose backlog is this?
Yeah, great question. I tend to think of an improvement backlog as being kind of like a recursive idea. So a team will have its own improvement backlog. Now, I'm not trying to make Agile any harder than it already is, right? I mean, a lot of teams will have a refinement backlog, right? And, it's just, it's often just a Word document or something, a Google Doc, right? Hey, here's 8 refactorings we want to do when we have time, right? It's no big deal, right? Or they are things in their main Jira product backlog and they're tagged with refinement or refactoring. And so these might just be in your Jira backlog and we just tag them with improvement, right? And they're just improvement opportunities in there. And so a team will have its own improvement backlog. And sometimes these come out of retrospectives. But if we're focused on a larger agile initiative, right, we're trying to get an organization or department or a set of teams and project program agile, then we'll have an improvement backlog or use the term transformation backlog. We'll have more of that kind of master improvement backlog that cuts across an entire product. And let's say that's, 12 teams or something. And so we'll have that improvement backlog. What I like to do then is to encourage the formation of improvement communities. And these are people who are passionate about improving in a certain area. And they might be a group of people who want to get us better at automated testing. Right. And so they form an improvement community. Another one might be about how do we get better at backlog management? And that might be about what are these job story things? Are they better than user stories? How do we get better at acceptance criteria? How do we start using AI to split our stories? And so an improvement community forms around those topics. And so I like to have leaders in an organization encourage the kind of ground up formation of these improvement communities that are passionate about subsets of ways to improve. Much better than saying, hey, Brian, why don't you go lead the improvement of this thing? And you're like, okay, but I'm more interested in that thing, right? And so encourage these to form from the ground up.
I love that. Yeah. So it's sort of organic, like when
Mhm.
there's a desire, then they form. And when the desire fades away, then maybe the improvement community fades away.
Yeah. Yeah. They should not necessarily be persistent. Some of them, could last forever. At Google many years ago, there was an improvement community focused on testing, and it was a very famous group. They put out a document about once a week called "Testing on the Toilet." You can Google this. It was written up in the New York Times. I think there's still a website that has a lot of the old articles they would do. And it was called that because they would tape them up in the various toilets around the Google headquarters and you could read them while you were on the toilet. And so, but it was about how do you test something as big as what Google was doing, right? And it was advice on that. And it was written by a group of passionate people trying to help others test their subsets of Google's products. And it disbanded after a while, right? They existed for a few years, solved the main problem they were after, and disbanded. And that's ideal.
Yeah, that's a great point, because if you want to raise the visibility of that, and it starts to populate around, then yeah, we've done our job.
Absolutely.
I'm kind of curious about these. If we go through this effort and we start to flesh out this transformation type backlog or improvement backlog, I'm kind of curious, is it sort of a project based mindset with this, that we put it together to get from A to B and then these disappear, or is it the kind of thing where maybe this could be more longer lived, that could go beyond just an initial change initiative?
Think it can be any of the above, right? I mean, we just gave the example of at Google with the testing community where it was across an organization, right? It wasn't tied to a project or product. It was across an organization, and I would say it was long lived and that it was a couple of years, right? But that it wasn't permanent, right? You don't want to institutionalize these things. So I think it's a little bit, product focused, right? What can our product do better? It's also what can our department do better? What can our organization do? And so that's where I was describing as a little bit recursive, right? You can have these improvement backlogs at different levels.
Yeah. This is great stuff, and I think it's so practical because it gives you that roadmap that I think a lot of times people feel sort of lost when they start this kind of thing, and they think, "Gosh, there's so much to do. Where do I even start to make it dent?" Well, we have an answer to that in the Agile community, because that's what we do on a regular basis anyway. So I think this is great because it gives that kind of ability be transparent about what needs to happen, and follow a kind of a roadmap that you put together. Mike, if people want to find out more about this or want to go deeper on it, is there something that somewhere we can point them?
Yeah, I'll give you a couple of links that you can put in the show notes. And certainly, I mean, this is kind of what we do at Mountain Goat Software. So you can contact us at mountaingoatsoftware.com. But I'll give you a couple of links in the show notes. We have a good diagram I can give you that you can link that shows what happens if one of the pillars is missing. For example, if mindset is missing, you end up with kind of temporary gains, right? Because you're not really going to be truly agile. And so we got a nice little graphic that summarizes what occurs if one of the pillars is insufficiently supported.
Yeah, I'm wondering too if you could maybe kind of describe for everyone, because I know we do a lot of training at Mountain Goat Software, but we also coach organizations and help them through this. I'm just wondering if maybe you could talk a little bit about that marriage a little bit of the training versus coaching, and why they're both important.
I think training is the thing that gets the big ball rolling, right? And it helps kind of get things started. And one of our goals in training is to have people leave excited, motivated about something. And that's what I love hearing. It's nice when somebody says, "Oh, I learned a lot," right? That I learned things from that class. But I think I get more excited when I hear people say that they're motivated to go do something with what they learn now. And so that's a part of what our training is trying to do. And I stopped many, many years ago doing engagements with clients that just wanted training. I would always do at least one day, now ideally more, but at least one day, and I'd stay for a third day. We'd do a 2-day class. And on the third day, I'd get their team started, because otherwise people hear this great stuff. They're motivated, but they're behind, right? It's like, oh no,
Yeah.
email backed up for 2 days, right? And, now they have to take a week to dig out of that email hole. And then they like, what did we learn a week ago? And so we always try to marry the coaching to the training, just to kind of keep the momentum going.
Yeah. Yeah, I've heard a lot of tales of people who come through training, and they, the whole company will come through. They'll get very, very excited about it. They even have sort of a debrief meeting afterwards where they'll get together and say, "All right, well, what are all the things we want to do? And here's what we're going to do." But then you're right. The next day, it's sort of the real world of now we got to catch up from all this stuff, and we're back to just the old way of doing it, because you can't just instantly be in this new way of doing things. You have to transition.
Well, it's right back to what we talked about with the CMM, right? You're at
Yeah.
level 2 when you stick with it, right?
Yeah.
You're really starting to believe in Agile when you stick with it. And if you go through the Agile training class and you can't make time for it, not unsurprisingly, you're not really Agile yet, right? And how would you be? You just got trained 2 days ago. But you got to have that. You got to have that commitment to do it. Otherwise, it doesn't stick.
Yeah. Yeah. This is such good stuff, Mike. I really appreciate you making time to share this with us. I hope everyone finds this really useful. And like Mike said, if you want to find out more about this, we'll put some links in the show note, but contact us, reach out to us at Mountain Goat Software. You can email hello at Mountain Goat Software. And we'd love to talk to you a little bit more about if there's a way we can help you on this.
That'd be great. Thanks for having me, Brian.
Thanks, Mike.